She had lost everything: her husband, her young son, and the will to keep breathing. For 12 long years, she carried the guilt like a lead weight tied to her neck, convinced that fate had punished her family for some unknown sin. But when hunger and despair became unbearable, when there was nowhere left to run, she found herself forced to return to that house in the remote plains of Oklahoma, the same place where everything had fallen apart. And it was there, in that place forgotten by time, that the past began to whisper its secrets. What she thought was just the cutting wind of the plains was, in fact, the echo of something much darker, a secret someone had tried to bury forever, a secret capable of completely transforming everything she believed about the tragedy that destroyed her life. Before we go on, tell me in the comments below, have you ever discovered that someone was hiding an important secret from you? What was that experience like? Let's begin. The wind was the first to greet her, and it was also the only sound that broke the silence. It wasn't a common wind. It wasn't that gentle breeze that sways the leaves of trees. It was a prolonged moan, a whisper laden with sadness that seeped through every crack in the dry wood and seemed, in some inexplicable way, to know her name. Mary had returned. She stood there, before the structure where she had lost absolutely everything, in that forgotten piece of the Oklahoma plains, in the year 1889. She returned not because she wanted to, but because the rawest necessity dragged her back, a widow for the second time in her life, holding firmly the trembling hand of her daughter Julia, the only spark of light left in her world transformed into darkness. Misery forced her to seek shelter precisely at the epicenter of her pain, a place she had sworn to herself she would never set foot in again. 12 full years had passed. The memory hit her like a punch to the gut as her feet hesitated on the path covered with dry weeds and thorns. The first time she fled this property, she did so covered in ashes and dressed in a grief so profound she could barely breathe, right after the catastrophe that split her existence in two. First came the inexplicable fall of her husband Frank, who plunged from the roof of this very building while repairing some broken tiles. Then, as if it were a cruel mockery of fate, just 9 days later came the strange fever that took her eldest son Peter, a boy of only 7. 2 deaths so close, so absurd, that they shattered her sanity and left her empty inside, fleeing without looking back, abandoning the property to whoever wanted to occupy it. Now the house was a decaying skeleton, an empty shell, abandoned in the middle of nowhere that no one claimed as their own anymore. The doors hung crooked, held by hinges corroded by rust, dancing macabrely with each gust of wind. Dust covered absolutely everything like a grayish shroud, hiding broken furniture and memories that still bled in every forgotten corner. The air was heavy, dense, carrying a strong smell of rotten wood, of time standing still, and of something more, something Mary instantly recognized, the smell of fear. An ancient fear that had permeated the adobe walls and now awakened with her return, recognizing her as an old companion coming home after too long an absence. She let go of Julia's hand, asking with a gentle but firm gesture for the girl to wait at the entrance. The child obeyed without questioning, her large brown eyes fixed on her mother's back, unable to understand why that broken and ugly place made the bravest woman she knew tremble so. Mary advanced alone, her steps raising small clouds of dust that danced in the rare rays of light that managed to penetrate through the cracked windows. Her feet knew the way by heart. She didn't go to the kitchen or the main living room. She walked directly to the back bedroom, the one that had belonged to Peter, the same one she had locked away in her memory with every possible bolt, hoping never to have to open it again as long as she lived. And there it was. Frank's small, carved wooden crib still occupied the same spot, but it was overturned in a corner as if an explosion of violence had thrown it there. Mary approached slowly, extending a hand that trembled visibly. The moment her fingers merely grazed the wood polished by time, the 12 years of pent-up, festering pain struck her with the force of an enraged bull. Her knees buckled. She collapsed onto the earthen floor, muffling a choked cry in the fabric of her mended skirt, while burning tears scorched the accumulated dust on her face. The pain was physical, an overwhelming pressure in her chest that threatened to tear her in two again. Julia watched from the doorway, completely motionless. The girl didn't understand the depth of that ancient wound, but she perfectly understood the universal language of a mother's suffering. Mary, feeling the weight of her daughter's gaze, struggled desperately to regain her breath. She wiped her face furiously, swallowing the bitter poison of remembrance. She couldn't completely fall apart, not now. She needed to be strong for Julia, the only reason she was still breathing, the only reason she had gathered enough courage to sleep again under the roof that had crushed her soul. She straightened her back with effort and stood up, dust marking her knees through her worn dress. That night, the true terror truly began. They improvised a bed using some old blankets in the main bedroom, far from the overturned crib. Outside, the plains wind howled incessantly like a lost animal seeking an entrance. Julia, exhausted from the long journey, quickly fell asleep, clutching a tattered rag doll. Mary, however, remained awake, sitting against the cold wall, watching the shadows that moved with the silvery moonlight filtering through the broken windows. The house creaked, complained, breezed around her, but the wind was definitely the worst part. It was a constant sound that enveloped the building and completely isolated it from the rest of the world. That's when she heard it. It wasn't a normal creak of old wood or the whistle of air through loose tiles. It was something completely different. Amidst the constant lament of the wind, she heard a voice with perfect clarity. It was delicate, almost like a child's, a whisper that seemed to be born and die in the same gust of air. "Mother." Mary froze in place. Her heart leaped so violently that she felt a metallic taste invade her mouth. She held her breath, absolutely certain she had imagined it, that the pain was playing a cruel trick on her mind. But the wind blew even harder. This time she heard more clearly. "Mother." She jumped up, terror running down her spine like a cold shiver. She ran to Julia and gently shook her. "Julia, wake up. Did you hear that? Did you hear the voice?" The girl opened her eyes, confused and still sleepy, shaking her head. "I only hear the wind, Mama. It's making a lot of noise." Mary hugged her tightly, feeling the small, warm body against hers. She forced herself to calm down. It was grief. It was extreme exhaustion. It was returning to this cursed place that was playing with her head. There was nothing real there. It was just her daughter, and a ruined house full of too many painful memories. But the next night, the whisper returned with even greater intensity. Mary was already expecting it, awake in the darkness with her nerves completely on edge. The wind picked up just after midnight, and with it came the voice. "Mom, Mom." This time it was impossible to deny, and it was accompanied by something new, a rhythmic, subtle knocking, as if someone was gently tapping a finger from some impossible-to-locate place. It wasn't branches against the outer wall. It wasn't a loose door swinging. The sound came from within, from deep within the structure. The days became a torture of constant vigilance. The silence during the day was almost worse than the nocturnal whispers, because in the absolute quiet, Mary felt watched by the house itself. She tried to repair the irreparable, to bring life back to a place that seemed to actively reject her. She nailed loose boards over the cracks where the wind whistled, but the sound of the hammer felt hollow, absorbed by the adobe and the accumulated misfortune. She scrubbed the floor with a damp cloth, trying to erase the stains of 12 years of total abandonment. But the smell of rotten wood and stagnant time stubbornly persisted, clinging to her clothes and hair. Each task was a battle against the past, and she felt she was losing, that the house merely tolerated her, patiently waiting for darkness to fall again. Julia, for her part, she tried to be a child in a place that had no room for childhood. She played silently on the porch, drawing figures in the accumulated dust, but never strayed far from Mary's sight. The girls' laughter, which used to be easy and resonant, was now scarce, stifled by the oppressive atmosphere that dominated everything. Mary watched her sweep with a makeshift broom of twigs, her small body moving with a seriousness that didn't match her age, and her heart ached painfully. This house wasn't just stealing her peace, it was stealing her daughter's joy, and that was a sin Mary wasn't sure she could forgive. Guilt devoured her alive during those hours of relentless plains light. The silence was a blank canvas where her mind projected her worst fears and regrets. Why wasn't she with Frank on the roof that fateful day? He had asked her to hold the ladder, but she was busy taking care of Peter, too tired, and told him to wait a bit. He didn't wait. And Peter's fever. Why didn't she see the signs sooner? Why did she ignore the first chill as just a passing discomfort? The guilt was driving her mad, much faster than any whisper carried by the wind. She felt trapped in an endless cycle of remorse, having returned to the exact place where her mistakes became fatal. One afternoon, as the sun began to paint the sky a sickly orange, a sound broke the suffocating quiet. It wasn't the wind. It was the controlled gallop of an approaching horse. Mary felt an instant chill spread through her stomach. A visitor was more terrifying than any ghost. She peered through the broken window pane. A lone rider was approaching on the dirt road. It was Robert, her brother-in-law, Frank's younger brother. She recognized him immediately by the same rigid posture, the same immaculate farmer's clothes that contrasted brutally with her own misery. The man emanated an air of absolute control, of calculated coldness, which had always deeply bothered her, even when Frank was still alive. Robert stopped his horse at a calculated distance from the house without bothering to dismount. His eyes, gray as polished steel, swept over the crumbling facade, paused on Julia, who had hidden behind Mary's skirts, and finally rested on her. His gaze was a cold assessment, an inspection. There was no pity in them, just a chilling calculation. Mary felt the need to cover herself, to hide her mud-stained hands and the visible patch on her dress. Before him, her poverty felt like a personal accusation, a failure he had come to confirm with his own eyes, savoring the spectacle. "Mary, how imprudent," he finally said. His voice was as cutting as his gaze, effortlessly slicing through the heavy air. "To come back here, and with the girl, no less. What were you thinking?" It wasn't a real question, it was a judgment already delivered. Mary pressed her lips together, feeling rage burn up her throat, but she contained it with effort. She couldn't afford the luxury of anger right now. She stood on a property that legally might not even be hers anymore, despite being abandoned. "We had nowhere else to go, Robert. The drought in the north left us with absolutely nothing," she replied, her voice firmer than she truly felt inside. Robert let out a dry laugh, an unpleasant sound that didn't move a single muscle of his stony face. "No other place? There are always other places, Mary. They just aren't free." He looked at the house again, this time with a strange and unsettling intensity. "This place is cursed. Don't you remember? The local folks say they hear things at night, moans. They say the devil made his nest here after what happened to Frank and the boy." His words were carefully chosen to wound, to drive fear exactly where he knew it would hurt most. Did he know about the whispers, or was he just repeating rumors? He paused deliberately, letting the poison of his words take effect. Mary remained motionless, though she trembled inside. How could he know what was heard during the nights? Or was it a trap? Robert leaned slightly over the saddle, lowering his voice to a tone of false confidentiality, as if about to reveal a valuable secret. "Listen closely. I am a generous man. I don't like seeing you like this, dragging my niece through the mud. I'm going to make an offer. Sell this property to me. I'll pay a reasonable sum, enough for you to leave here and start over in another town. Consider it charity in memory of my brother." The offer hit her harder than a direct insult. To sell the house for a miserable sum. The same house no one claimed. The same one that was rotten and supposedly cursed. Suddenly, the supernatural fear she had felt in the darkness receded, replaced by a cold, human suspicion. Why did he want this crumbling structure with such insistence? Why now, precisely when she had returned? What was in this abandoned shell that Robert, owner of almost all the fertile lands in the county, could so eagerly desire? "It's not for sale, Robert," Mary said, surprising herself with the harshness in her own voice. "It's the only thing I have left of Frank." Robert's expression visibly darkened. The steel in his eyes turned to pure, cutting ice. "You are making a grave mistake, Mary. A mistake you will regret." He straightened in the saddle, pulling hard on the reins. "Think carefully about what I'm offering. It's for your daughter's sake." The veiled threat hung in the air, heavier and more real than any whisper carried by the wind. He turned his horse around and departed with the same controlled gallop with which he had arrived, leaving only a cloud of red dust behind. The dust raised by Robert's horse took an eternity to settle completely. Mary stood on the porch, trembling, but no longer just from fear. It was a cold rage, a deep indignation that burned in her stomach. Robert had not only failed to help her for 12 years, but now appeared to threaten her, to drive her from the little she had left. The charity of his offer was an insult wrapped in calculated contempt, and his insistence on a destroyed house made no sense at all, unless the ruins hid something of real value, or unless her presence there, Mary's presence, represented a threat to him in some way. Suspicion was a bitter seed that had just taken deep root in her mind. Julia emerged from her hiding place and clung tightly to her mother's skirt, staring fixedly at the path where the man had disappeared. "Mommy, that man is very bad," the girl whispered, her voice perfectly capturing the tension the adult had left behind. Mary lifted her into her arms, kissing her hair full of plains dust. "You don't need to be afraid, my love. He won't hurt us." But even as she said it, Mary knew it was a necessary lie. Robert was a real, tangible danger, a wolf in farmer's clothing circling the property, waiting for the right moment to attack. Now she wasn't just fighting the ghosts of her past, she was fighting a flesh and blood enemy who coveted her pain and her ruin. That night, the atmosphere inside the house changed drastically. The fear of the supernatural was still present, but now it competed with the anxiety of human danger. Every creak of the old wood, every gust of wind against the walls made Mary jump, thinking it was Robert returning under the cloak of darkness. The wind continued to blow relentlessly, but now, contaminated by the threatening visit, it no longer sounded merely like a child's lament. It sounded like a clear warning, as if the house, or whatever inhabited it, was as restless as she was, alerting her to a greater danger lurking outside its own shadows. The house and she were now uneasy allies against the hostile outer world. And then the whisper returned with renewed force, but this time it was relentless and impossible to ignore. It was no longer a soft, distant lament. It was a desperate, urgent plea that pierced her ears. "Mother, in the cold, in the cold!" Over and over again, the voice hammered at her consciousness ceaselessly. Mary covered her face with her hands, trying to block the sound. Cold? What cold? They were in the scorching summer of the plains. The knocking was also stronger, more insistent, like an impossible Morse code to decipher. It came from a specific place in the house. She followed the sound intently, crawling across the dusty floor while Julia slept deeply. It wasn't the outer walls, it was the floor, near the old fireplace, near the abandoned wood-burning stove. Mary couldn't take it anymore. Madness was scratching at the edges of her sanity. Trapped between the fear of Robert and the torment of this persistent voice, she knew she couldn't survive another night of psychological siege. She needed to know the truth. She needed to confront whatever was down there, whether it was real or just a product of her shattered mind. If it was a real ghost, she would talk to it. If it was an elaborate trick, she would uncover it. And if it was Robert manipulating everything, she would face him directly. She lit the oil lamp. Her hands trembled so much that the small flame danced violently, casting monstrous shadows that writhed on the adobe walls. Hot oil dripped onto her fingers, but the pain barely registered in her consciousness. She knelt by the abandoned fireplace. The inside was filled with cold ashes and soot from a decade ago. The smell was sour, a mix of burnt and mold. The wind howled strongly up the chimney pipe, a hollow sound that made her skin crawl completely. The knocking was clear and unmistakable now, right beneath her knees. She felt around the floorboards surrounding the stone base of the fireplace. They were more worn than the others, the wood soft and corroded by relentless time. She pushed one experimentally, and it moved easily. It wasn't properly nailed down. Another board was also too loose. Someone had lifted these boards before, there was no doubt. Her heart pounded so hard against her ribs that she feared waking Julia with the noise. This was not part of the house's original construction. Frank had never mentioned anything about a basement or secret hiding place. Or had he? Her memory was a confused labyrinth of pain, full of locked doors and dark corridors. The whisper returned so close this time that it seemed to come from the very crack she was touching. In the cold, in the cold. With a sudden, determined movement, she thrust the tip of a rusty kitchen knife she carried in her apron into the opening between the boards. She pried with all the strength that desperation granted her. The old wood protested with a sharp groan, like an animal being mortally wounded. The board gave way at once, then another, and another. The smell that rose from the open hole almost made her vomit violently. It wasn't the clean smell of common earth. It was the penetrating odor of decomposition, of something damp and stagnant for years, a foul breath that had been trapped for a long time. But down there, in the absolute darkness that the oil lamp could barely penetrate, there was no dry, hard earth. There was a real void, a dark and deep space. And in that space, something moved distinctly. It wasn't a rat or an opossum. It was something larger and heavier. Mary recoiled with a jump, stifling a scream of terror, her hand painfully hitting the rough stone of the fireplace. She wasn't alone in this house. She never had been. The terror she felt at that moment was pure and paralyzing, freezing every muscle in her body. But the voice, the insistent whisper, had stopped completely. The exact moment the boards were opened, the lament ceased abruptly. All that remained was the sound of the wind in the chimney and her own ragged, desperate breath. The knocking had also suddenly stopped. Had she released something terrible, or had she interrupted something important? She lowered the oil lamp towards the black hole, her eyes struggling frantically to focus in the dusty darkness that seemed to swallow the light. She saw nothing initially, just dense shadows upon more shadows. She plunged her trembling hand into the cold earth bordering the hole, and her fingers touched something unexpected. It wasn't soft like common fabric, nor hard like stone. It was rough leather almost rotten from accumulated moisture. She pulled carefully. It was firmly stuck. She pulled with more force, fear giving her an irrational and desperate courage. Something finally came out of the compacted earth. It wasn't a wooden box. It wasn't an old diary. It was a small object wrapped in several layers of thick fabric, discolored by time. She held it in her trembling palm under the lamp's yellowish, flickering light. It was a volume approximately the size of her closed fist and surprisingly light. Mary stood completely still, staring fixedly at the package in her hand. It was covered in red dirt and smelled intensely of mold, of time buried and forgotten. It weighed almost nothing, which made everything even more unsettling. For a terrifying moment, the fear of what the package contained was greater than the fear of the nocturnal whispers. What kind of secret did the earth beneath her home guard so zealously? Was it an amulet of protection against evil, or was it the very source of the evil that dwelt there? Julia coughed lightly in her sleep, a small but real sound that cut through Mary's panic like a sharp knife. It brought her back to reality. She was doing this for her, for Julia, for their uncertain future. No matter what she found inside that mysterious package, it would be better than the suffocating uncertainty that was slowly drowning them. With a trembling sigh that came from the depths of her soul, she took the package and the lamp to the broken table. With fingers that barely obeyed her commands, she began to unwrap the thick fabric carefully. The cloth was rotted, crumbling at the slightest touch, stuck together by moisture and forgotten for long years. It was a delicate and agonizing task, harder than opening an ancient tomb. Each layer she removed seemed to release more smell of cold earth and death. She expected to find anything, a lock of hair, childish things, a saved baby tooth, an oxidized religious medal, something to confirm the presence of a secret child's grave. Her heart pounded with an almost sickening anticipation. The house was in absolute heavy silence now. Even the wind seemed to have completely stopped, holding its breath with her, anxiously waiting to see what secret had been so zealously guarded for so long. Finally, after minutes that felt like hours, the last piece of fabric came loose and fell. Inside, there was no shining treasure, nor an indescribable horror. There were two simple but devastating things. The first was a small whistle, a simple bamboo whistle, like those country folk carve for their children on lazy Sunday afternoons. It was stained with red dirt, but intact and functional. Mary recognized it instantly and felt as if the air had been brutally knocked from her lungs. Frank used to carve these whistles for Peter with his skilled hands. He had an artisan's hands. hands that transformed wood and bamboo into magical toys, into promises of happiness. Peter adored them completely, running around the yard blowing until he was dizzy and breathless. Next to the whistle was a yellowed piece of paper. It had been folded many times over itself, and the extreme humidity had turned it into a fragile mass that threatened to disintegrate at any moment. It was an impressive miracle that it hadn't completely turned to dust. With infinite care, the tip of the rusty knife as a tool, Mary slowly unfolded it onto the cracked wooden table. The weak lamplight illuminated the graphite marks, blurred and almost illegible by time. But it wasn't Frank's elegant, firm handwriting that she knew so well. They were large, clumsy letters, leaning irregularly, traced by the unsure hand of a child barely learning to master a thick pencil. It was Peter's unmistakable handwriting. A chill that had absolutely nothing to do with the icy wind ran down her spine. It took several agonizing minutes to decipher the few written words. Her vision constantly blurred by tears she didn't realize she was freely shedding. "For the wind to sing to me when I sleep," she read the phrase over and over compulsively without fully understanding its meaning. And then, on a line below, with even more crooked, childish letters, "Daddy put it on the wall for me." Mary felt the solid floor of the house disappear completely beneath her feet. She clung desperately to the table, vertigo threatening to knock her down mercilessly. Daddy put it on the wall. The persistent wind, the constant whisper, the old fireplace. Suddenly, everything clicked with a brutal and absolutely devastating clarity in her mind. The terrifying whisper wasn't a real ghost. It wasn't her son's restless spirit returning from beyond. It was this simple bamboo whistle. Frank, in a gesture of infinite and touching love, must have found a perfect crevice in the chimney flue, a strategic spot where the strong wind of the plains, when channeled properly, would produce a melodious sound, a constant mechanical lullaby, a perpetual bedtime song, so his son would never feel alone in the frightening darkness of the night. The mom she heard with such terror wasn't a word truly being pronounced. It was the sharp tone of the bamboo, modulated by the variable force of the wind, a sound that her mind, completely broken by unbearable pain and predisposed by the cursed place, had desperately interpreted as the only word she longed to hear more than anything else in the world. And the rhythmic knocking, the persistent tapping that had terrified her night after night. It was certainly the same whistle, hanging from a sturdy thread or fitted in such an ingenious way that with the strongest gusts of wind, it gently tapped against the rough stone or adobe of the old chimney. It wasn't a desperate call from beyond. It was an innocent game, a precious secret between a loving father and son, an ingenious mechanism of love that had miraculously survived death, ironically transforming into the main source of her paralyzing terror. For 12 long years of solitude, the relentless wind had not mourned the terrible tragedy that shattered her family. It had simply continued faithfully singing the lullaby that Frank had taught with such affection and dedication. Mary collapsed completely onto the hard floor, but this time it was different from all the others. It wasn't the dry, painful blow of unbearable grief. It was a cathartic release, a deep sob that transformed into a muffled yet painful laugh. She had been terrified for years because of a child's toy. She had fled in terror from a loving lullaby. The terrible curse of the house, the malignant presence that Robert cynically used to threaten and expel her, was simply the purest and most touching proof of her husband's unwavering love. She brought the bamboo whistle to her trembling lips, but didn't blow into it. She pressed it tightly against her chest, along with Peter's yellowed, crumpled paper. She wept copiously for the immense love she had lost forever, and for the stupid, irrational fear that had kept her from that love for an entire decade of unnecessary suffering. But as the extreme tension finally abandoned her exhausted body, an icy and disturbing question slowly began to form in her tormented mind. If Frank had carefully placed it on the chimney wall, why had she found it buried deep beneath the floorboards? Peter? It must have been Peter himself, she concluded desperately. Perhaps after Frank's tragic death, the boy missed his father so much that he retrieved the precious whistle from the wall and buried it there as a secret treasure, a memory just for him, near the comforting warmth of the fireplace he had shared so much with his beloved father. Yes, that had to be the logical explanation. It was the only one that made any sense. She clung firmly to that idea because the alternative was too grim, too dark to even seriously contemplate. She finally felt liberated from a terrible weight. For the first time in 12 endless years, the heavy air of the house didn't feel suffocating and oppressive. The wind continued blowing outside with its usual force. But now that she finally understood its secret language, it no longer represented a terrifying threat. It was simply an echo, a melancholic memory. It was Frank and Peter affectionately saying hello from the distant past. The imaginary curse had completely broken. The house was just an old, abandoned house, nothing more. She wiped the tears from her face, angry at herself, feeling a completely new strength growing within her chest. She could face Robert now. She could face anything the world threw her way. She had definitive proof that this place wasn't filled with death and curses, but with genuine love and precious memories. She had been completely wrong about everything. The true curse, the true horror, was only just beginning to reveal itself in its terrifying full dimension. Hey, if you're enjoying this story and want to find out what really happened in that house, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell. And tell me something, have you ever had to return to a place from your past that brought painful memories? How was that experience? Share your story here in the comments. I love reading each one and knowing that we're not alone on these difficult journeys of life. All the lies and all the horror that place had kept for so long. Black smoke rose in thick spirals against the blue sky of the plains, visible for miles, an unmistakable sign that something monumental was happening in that forgotten piece of land. Behind them, Robert finally managed to get completely out of the burning house, rolling on the ground to extinguish the sparks that had stuck to his expensive clothes. He stood up furious, covered in ash and soot, watching helplessly as Mary and Julia disappeared around the bend of the dusty road. He mounted his horse, which he had tied at a safe distance, and considered pursuing them immediately. But the smoke was already attracting attention. He could see some country folk in the distance running towards the fire, curious and concerned. He couldn't just kill them now, not in front of witnesses. He would have to be smarter, more calculating. Robert galloped in the opposite direction, his mind working frantically on how to control the situation that was rapidly slipping from his grasp. He was a powerful man in the region, a landowner, respected by local merchants. He had connections, he had money, he had influence. The word of a poor widow covered in soot against his? He could still win this battle, he convinced himself as he rode. Mary and Julia walked for almost 2 hours under the scorching sun before finally spotting the first houses of the village of Hope Springs. It was a small place, with perhaps 200 souls living there, mostly poor farmers and small merchants. The Catholic Church dominated the town square, its white steeple shining brightly under the sun. Next door was the home of the municipal judge. Judge August Manson, a middle-aged man known for his moral strictness and dedication to the law. Mary knocked insistently on the heavy wooden door, her heart still pounding, her hands still trembling, holding the precious documents as if her life depended on them, and indeed it did. An elderly maid opened the door, visibly startled to see Mary's state, completely covered in black soot, her clothes torn and dirty, holding a small, equally frightened girl. "I need to speak with Judge August immediately," Mary said urgently, her voice hoarse from the inhaled smoke. "It's a matter of life or death. It's about murder." The word worked like magic. The maid quickly ushered them in, leading them to a waiting room while she went to fetch the judge. A few minutes later, which seemed like endless hours, Judge August Manson appeared. He was a tall man with neatly trimmed gray hair, wearing an impeccable dark suit despite the heat. His brown eyes were intelligent and observant, missing no detail of Mary's devastated appearance. "Madam, please sit down and explain what happened," he said in a calm but authoritative voice, indicating a chair. He offered fresh water to her and to Julia, who drank eagerly. Mary drank too, feeling the water cleanse the soot from her burning throat. Then, in a voice that started trembling but gained strength and determination as she went on, she told him absolutely everything. She told him about Frank's death 12 years ago, about the mysterious fever that took Peter, about her terrified escape from the supposedly cursed house. She told him about her forced return due to extreme poverty, the nocturnal whispers that terrified her, the discovery of the bamboo whistle and Peter's note, and then, with tears rolling freely down her soot-streaked face, she told him about the discovery of Frank's hidden letter in the chimney, his explicit accusations against Robert, the accounting ledger that proved the frauds, and finally, the violent confrontation that had just occurred, culminating in the fire that completely consumed the house. She carefully placed the yellowed letter and the heavy accounting ledger on the judge's polished mahogany desk. Judge August took the letter with reverent care, adjusting his reading glasses, and began to read in absolute silence. His face, initially skeptical, gradually transformed as he absorbed the devastating content. When he finished reading, his hands trembled visibly. He opened the accounting ledger, flipping through the densely written pages with numbers, dates, names of properties and farmers. "My God," he finally murmured, his voice heavy with genuine shock. This is explosive. If all this is true, and by Frank's handwriting, which I recognize from previous documents, it appears authentic, we're talking about systematic large-scale fraud, diversion of water resources, and," he paused, looking directly into Mary's eyes, "premeditated double homicide. The murder of his own brother and an innocent child." "It's all true, Judge August," Mary said firmly, her voice no longer faltering. "Robert confessed everything to me today, thinking he could kill me and destroy the evidence. He admitted to killing Frank because my husband discovered his frauds and was going to report him. And he admitted to poisoning my son Peter to ensure I would flee in terror and never return, leaving the property and the evidence behind." The judge remained silent for long moments, processing the enormity of what he had just heard. Finally, he stood up, his decision made. "Mrs. Mary, I will immediately issue an arrest warrant for Robert Travis. I will send my officers to arrest him today. This evidence is sufficient to open a full criminal proceeding." He paused, looking at her with a mixture of respect and compassion. "You were extremely brave to return to that house and uncover the truth. Many would have simply accepted their fate and moved on." Mary felt the tears return, but this time they were tears of relief mixed with the pain that had not yet fully healed. "I carried the guilt for 12 years, Judge. I thought I had failed as a wife and mother. Now I know I was a victim of a monster." The judge called his 2 bailiffs, strong and armed men, and gave them precise orders to locate and arrest Robert immediately, using force if necessary. The men left quickly, understanding the gravity of the situation. "You and your daughter will remain under my protection until Robert is apprehended," declared Judge August. "I cannot risk him trying something against you." He provided a room in his own house so that Mary and Julia could rest, wash, and eat something decent. For the first time in days, Mary felt she could finally breathe without the crushing weight of constant fear. Meanwhile, Robert had returned to his large, well-maintained ranch on the outskirts of the village. He changed clothes quickly, burning the soot-stained garments that incriminated him. His mind worked frantically. Mary had the evidence, but he had power and money. He could bribe witnesses, he could hire the best lawyers from the state capitol. He could make her seem like a traumatized madwoman, inventing stories out of desperation and misery. He was considering his options when he heard the gallop of horses approaching rapidly. He looked out the window and his heart sank. It was the judge's officers, accompanied by 4 extra-armed men. They came prepared for resistance. Robert considered fleeing through the back door, but knew it would be useless. Where would he go? He was too well known in the region. No, he had to face this, trust in his influence and his money to get out of this impossible situation. He opened the door before they could knock, adopting an expression of calculated confusion. "Officers, to what do I owe this unexpected visit?" he asked with false cordiality. The oldest officer, a gray-haired man with a thick mustache named Captain Thompson, wasted no time with pleasantries. "Robert Travis is under arrest by order of Judge August Manson, accused of premeditated double homicide, documentary fraud, and diversion of water resources. You need to come with us immediately." Robert's mask slipped momentarily, revealing the fury and panic beneath. This is complete nonsense. Based on what? On the word of a crazy widow? Captain Thompson approached, his hand resting on the revolver at his belt. "Based on documentary evidence written by the victim, sir. The deceased Frank left a detailed letter and incriminating accounting ledger. Now, will you come peacefully, or do we have to use force?" Robert knew he was cornered. Resisting would only worsen his legal situation. He needed time to think, to plan his defense. "I will cooperate fully, Captain. This is clearly a misunderstanding that will be cleared up quickly." He allowed them to place heavy handcuffs on his wrists, something he had never imagined happening to him. As he was escorted to the horse, he looked at his ranch, his property, everything he had lied, stolen, and killed for. Perhaps it had been worth it, he thought bitterly. Or perhaps it had been the biggest mistake of his life to underestimate the determination of a mother seeking justice for her dead children. Robert's trial began 6 weeks later, becoming the most significant event Hope Springs had witnessed in decades. People came from neighboring towns to watch, completely filling the small makeshift courtroom in the local church. The story had spread like wildfire. The rich and respected rancher accused of murdering his own brother and nephew out of greed. It was the kind of scandal that would fuel conversations for generations. Mary testified for almost 3 hours, her voice firm and clear, recounting every detail from the beginning. She presented Frank's letter, which was read aloud to the entire crowded court, eliciting shocked murmurs and exclamations of horror. The accounting ledger was meticulously examined by an accountant brought specially from the Capitol, who confirmed that it clearly showed a systematic pattern of fraud that had enriched Robert at the expense of dozens of small farmers. Several of these farmers also testified, telling how Robert had gradually taken control of their land through falsified documents and intimidation. The local doctor, Dr. Simmons, testified that he had always found Frank's sudden death strange, a young and healthy man who knew that roof well. And Peter's fever, he reluctantly admitted, presented symptoms consistent with arsenic poisoning, something he hadn't considered at the time because he had no reason to suspect a crime. Robert hired the best lawyers money could buy, eloquent men from New York City who argued brilliantly that the letter could be fake, that the accounting ledger could have been tampered with, that there was no direct physical proof of murder after so many years. But the confession he had made to Mary in the house, admitting everything, was the final blow. Julia, despite her young age, also testified, confirming that she had heard her uncle admit to killing her father and brother. After 3 days of intense trial, the 12-man jury retired to deliberate. They returned just 2 hours later, their grim faces revealing the verdict before it was even pronounced. Guilty, declared the jury foreman, a respected elderly rancher in the community. Guilty of all crimes for which he was accused. The murmur in the room erupted into loud conversations. The judge repeatedly banged his gavel, calling for order. Robert remained impassive as the sentence was read. Life imprisonment with hard labor, confiscation of all fraudulently obtained properties to be returned to their rightful owners, and substantial financial compensation for Mary and Julia. There would be no hanging, as the state had abolished the death penalty years before, but he would spend the rest of his miserable life in a distant prison, his name forever stained, his legacy completely destroyed. As he was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, Robert passed Mary. For a brief moment, their eyes met. In them, she saw no remorse or regret, only pure hatred and the bitterness of someone defeated. But Mary felt no fear. She felt only a deep peace, knowing that Frank and Peter finally had justice, that their deaths had not been in vain, that the truth always finds a way to emerge, no matter how long it takes or how deeply it is buried. In the following months, Mary used part of the financial compensation to rebuild a dignified life for herself and Julia. She did not return to that land where so much pain had occurred. The house had burned completely to its foundations, and she left it that way, a silent monument to the secrets that had finally been revealed. Instead, she bought a small but comfortable house in the town of Hope Springs itself, where she became known as a woman of extraordinary courage. Julia grew up strong and healthy, carrying within her the story of her family, a story of tragedy but also of triumphant justice. Mary never remarried. The love of her life had been Frank, and although he had been brutally stolen from her, the good memories she had of him were enough to fill her heart. She visited the local cemetery regularly, where she had finally managed to build dignified gravestones for Frank and Peter, bringing fresh flowers and telling them about her life, about Julia, about how justice had prevailed. The bamboo whistle, that simple object that had been both a source of terror and the key to discovering the truth, she kept in a special box. Sometimes, on quiet nights, when Julia was already asleep, Mary would take it out and hold it gently, remembering Frank's love, his ingenuity, how even in death he had found a way to guide her to the truth. The wind that had frightened her for so long was now just wind again, but she would always hear in it an echo of her past, a reminder that true love never truly dies. The properties confiscated from Robert were redistributed to the farmers he had stolen from, restoring some economic justice to the region. Frank's accounting ledger became preserved evidence of how an honest man had fought against corruption, even knowing it could cost him his life. Local teachers began to tell his story to children as an example of integrity and courage. As for Robert, he spent his final years in a cold, damp prison, far from everything he knew, performing hard labor under constant surveillance. He never expressed genuine remorse, but his arrogance gradually gave way to a quiet bitterness as the reality of his choices slowly consumed him. He died alone and forgotten 15 years later, a brutal contrast to the powerful man he once was. Mary lived to an old age. seeing Julia marry and have her own children. Her grandchildren grew up hearing the story of how their courageous grandmother had defied a powerful and dangerous man to reveal the truth, how she had transformed fear into strength, how she had honored the memory of those she loved by relentlessly seeking justice. And when Mary finally closed her eyes for the last time, surrounded by family who loved her, she departed in peace, knowing that she had fulfilled the silent promise she had made to Frank and Peter in that ruined house. The truth would be known, justice would be done, and they would never be forgotten. The house was never rebuilt or destroyed. The land remained empty, and with time, nature reclaimed it, covering the burned foundations with grass and wildflowers. But the people of the region still talk about that place, not as a cursed spot, but as a testament to the power of truth and the determination of a woman who refused to let the crimes against her family remain hidden. And on windy nights, some say they can still hear a soft sound, like a distant whistle, not a lament, but a lullaby, a reminder that love persists beyond death, beyond time, beyond all the darkness that tries to erase it. And so ends this story of mystery, tragedy, and ultimate justice. If you were moved by Mary's journey, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more emotional stories like this. And now I want to hear from you. Have you ever discovered a truth about the past that completely changed your understanding of something important? How did you deal with that revelation? Tell your story in the comments below. Your experience might help someone going through something similar. We are a community here, and your stories matter a lot to all of us. What did you learn from Mary's story? That sometimes the greatest courage isn't not being afraid, but moving forward despite it? That truth, no matter how deeply buried, always finds a way to the light. Share your reflections in the comments. Let's create a meaningful conversation together. And if you know someone who needs to hear a story about finding strength in adversity, share this video with them. Sometimes the right stories arrive at exactly the right time. Thank you very much for watching until the end. Until the next story, and remember, your courage might be greater than you imagine.